In a lawless land where justice is only what a man can take by his own hand, a stranger arrives, a lone guardian with nothing but his will and his gun. 3 years ago, he stumbled upon a terrified young man running from a ruthless tyrant who enslaves the town with fear and debt. What followed would shatter not only his peace but the very foundations of the whole settlement. This isn't just a story about guns or grudges, it's about courage, sacrifice, and how even one person can ignite a revolution. Tell us where you're watching this story in the comments below, and if these tales of justice and hope speak to you, don't forget to subscribe. Now, lean in and get ready to witness a battle for freedom that will grip your soul. I didn't come looking for trouble that morning. Trouble has a way of finding me whether I want it or not. The sun was barely over the hills, spilling gold over the scrub and dust, when I saw him. Just a thin figure on the ridge ahead, swaying like a sapling in the wind. I could tell from the way he moved that he was running on what little strength he had left, though there was no one in sight behind him. Sometimes you can tell when someone's fleeing a man rather than a place. There's a kind of urgency in their steps, a haunted look that clings to them even in open country. The air was dry enough to crack your lips, and my canteen had more sand than water in it, but I still nudged my horse in his direction. From that distance, the boy, though I couldn't yet be sure of his age, looked as if a stiff gust would knock him clean over. When I got closer, I saw the dust-caked hair, the tattered shirt with a shoulder seam coming apart, the way his boots had worn clean through at the toes. His eyes found me for just a second before darting to the horizon again, as if expecting someone else to appear. Then his knees buckled, and he went down in the dirt without a sound. I swung down from the saddle, crouched beside him, and pressed a hand to his shoulder. His skin burned hot under my palm, heat exhaustion, maybe worse. I poured a thin stream of water against his cracked lips, careful not to give too much at once. He coughed, sputtered, then drank greedily. His voice, when it finally came, was no louder than a whisper, but I caught 2 words clear as day. Don't take me back. Now, I've heard a fair share of strange requests in my life, but something in the way he said it stopped me cold. I asked him where back was, but his gaze slid away, fixed on some memory I couldn't see. That was when I knew, whatever he'd left behind was worse than the thought of collapsing alone out here in the wilderness. We made slow progress toward my camp, him riding slumped in the saddle while I walked beside the horse. The whole time, I kept scanning the horizon. This stretch of land had a reputation. Folks called it the Dead Bend territory, not because of any single massacre or disaster, but because it was the kind of place where the law looked the other way, and a man's worth was measured by the number of people afraid to cross him. I'd passed through here twice before and learned that it was better to keep moving, eyes forward, mouth shut. But now, with this boy in tow, I knew keeping to myself wouldn't be an option. When we reached my camp, I got a fire going and set some beans to warm. He wouldn't eat at first, just sat there staring into the flames like they held the answer to some riddle only he knew. Eventually, hunger won out, and he started spooning food into his mouth in quick, cautious bites. It was then I got my first real look at him. He was younger than I'd thought, maybe 17 at most, though the sun and hardship had carved lines where none should be yet. There was a bruise under one eye, half hidden by the dirt, and a split at the corner of his mouth. Signs of a recent fight, or maybe just a beating. He didn't offer his name, and I didn't push. In these parts, a man's name can be a dangerous thing to give away too soon. We spent the night under a blanket of stars, the air cooling enough that the boy finally stopped sweating. But I didn't sleep much. I kept catching the sound of distant hoofbeats that might have been real or might have been my own nerves. Out here, both can kill you just the same. By dawn, he was sitting up, looking more awake but still carrying that hunted look. That's when he finally spoke more than a handful of words. Said there was a man, a big name, in a nearby settlement called Dry Creek. A man who held the town in his grip like a wolf with a rabbit, and who'd make sure anyone who crossed him paid in ways worse than death. The boy had worked for him under something called a debt contract. Said it like it was supposed to mean something legal. But from the tremor in his voice, I could tell it was nothing more than chains without the iron. Dry Creek. I'd heard of it. Not much more than a strip of buildings baking under the sun, but it had a reputation for swallowing good people whole. The man he spoke of, I guessed, was Silas Cade, the kind of figure you don't say aloud unless you're ready for the consequences. Word was Cade controlled every trade, every card game, and half the law in 3 counties. Folks either worked for him or learned quick to get out of his way. The boy didn't ask me to take him there, but he didn't have to. The way his eyes flicked east toward the town told me he knew Cade's men would be looking. And if they found him out here alone, there'd be no second chances. I've got my own set of rules, some I've kept, some I've bent, and a few I've broken beyond repair. But one I hold to is this: if someone crosses your path in need, you either help them or you walk away for good. You don't hand them back to the wolves. And I wasn't ready to walk away. So I told him we'd ride for Dry Creek. Not to return him, but to see just how deep Cade's claws had sunk into the place. And maybe, just maybe, to pull them out. I didn't know it yet, but that decision would set fire to the whole rotten nest. We rode at a slow, steady pace toward Dry Creek, the morning sun already biting at our backs. The boy sat hunched in the saddle ahead of me, shoulders stiff as if bracing for a blow that hadn't come yet. I didn't know his name, and I figured pressing him for it now would do more harm than good. Some people don't give you their name until they've decided whether you're worth trusting. The trail into town wound between dry gullies and low ridges, the kind of terrain that can hide a dozen rifles without you knowing until it's too late. I kept my eyes moving. In these parts, an ambush didn't always come from enemies. Sometimes it came from men who claimed to be your friends, if the price was right. By the time the first buildings came into view, the heat had turned the horizon to a shimmering mirage. Dry Creek looked like a place holding its breath. 2 rows of weather-beaten storefronts leaned toward each other across a strip of packed dirt that passed for a main street. A few wagons stood hitched in front of the general store, and a blacksmith's hammer rang somewhere in the distance. But it wasn't the sound that struck me, it was the silence behind it. People noticed us. I could feel their eyes from the shadowed porches and half-drawn curtains. Yet nobody waved, nobody called out a greeting. They just watched. We passed the saloon first. A man in a dusty bowler hat stood in the doorway, arms folded, chewing something slow and deliberate. His eyes tracked us until we were almost past, and then he spat into the street. Not the kind of spit a man gives when clearing his throat, the kind meant for someone to notice. The boy's hands tightened on the saddle horn. I leaned forward and spoke low so only he could hear. Keep your head up, but your mouth shut. Folks here have long memories for strangers. He gave the faintest nod, but his gaze stayed forward. We stopped in front of the livery stable, and I handed the reins to a wiry stable hand who looked barely older than the boy. Water him, brush him down, I said, slipping him a coin. The kid nodded, but his eyes darted toward the boy, lingered for half a second, and then dropped to the ground. Like he'd seen him before. Like he didn't want me to notice. Inside the stable shade, I caught the first real whisper of Cade's presence. A poster hung on the wall, not the printed kind from the law, but a hand-painted notice in bold red letters. Debtors, report immediately to Cade's office. Failure to comply will result in forfeit. Forfeit of what? It didn't say. It didn't have to. We headed toward the general store to pick up supplies. The moment we stepped through the door, the shopkeeper, a broad woman with sharp eyes, went still. Her hands froze over the stack of ledgers she'd been sorting. She looked at me, then at the boy, then back at me again. You planning on staying long? She asked. Not in a friendly way. Long enough to take care of business, I said. Her gaze lingered on the boy again. Best take care quick. This ain't the place for lingering. We gathered what we needed in silence. I could feel the boy shrinking into himself, avoiding the woman's eyes. When we stepped back out into the sunlight, 2 men were waiting. They weren't dressed like lawmen, but their boots and gun belts were clean, and their eyes had the flat look of men used to getting what they came for. One of them, tall, with a scar cutting down through his right eyebrow, smiled without warmth. Mornin', he said. Mr. Cade's been expectin' you. I let my gaze drift over them slow, sizing them up. Funny, I said. I don't recall making an appointment. The smile stayed, but his eyes hardened. Mr. Cade don't wait for folks to make appointments. If he wants to see you, you go. Beside me, the boy shifted, and I caught the quick rise and fall of his breath. His hand twitched toward his thigh, not for a weapon, he didn't have one, but in a nervous habit that told me he'd had this conversation before. Tell Cade, I said, that I'll come by when I'm good and ready. The tall man's smile disappeared. That ain't how it works. The second man stepped forward, a shorter, heavier type with a face that had seen more bottles than barber chairs. You can walk now, he said, or you can be carried. I didn't move for a long moment. The street had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that gathers when folks expect gunfire. My hand rested just above the butt of my Colt, but I didn't draw. Not yet. Finally, I stepped forward until I was close enough to see the stubble on the tall man's jaw. Tell your boss I'm not some drifter he can push around. If he wants a word, he can come find me himself. For a second, I thought we'd come to blows right there. But the tall man gave a slow nod, like he'd just marked me down in some mental ledger. Suit yourself, he said. Just remember, Cade don't ask twice. They stepped aside, letting us pass, but their eyes stayed on our backs until we turned the corner. We found a room above the saloon, not the best place to lay low, but I wanted to keep us close to the center of things. The boy said nothing until the door was shut and the bolt drawn. Then he turned to me, eyes burning with something between anger and fear. You don't understand, he said. When Cade sends for you, you go. If you don't, he sends the riders. I'd heard of them. Cade's enforcers, half a dozen men on black horses who rode under the cover of night, leaving behind smashed windows, burned barns, and bodies nobody dared to bury until dawn. I'm still standing, I told him. So are you. That means Cade hasn't won yet. The boy shook his head, as if I'd just spoken in a language he didn't understand. You think this is about winning? Cade doesn't lose. People here don't fight back, not because they're cowards, but because he takes more than your life. He takes everything you care about, and he leaves you breathing just long enough to wish you weren't. I let the words settle between us. Outside, the saloon piano started up, a cheerful tune that felt wrong in the thick air. Then we'll just have to change the way things work around here, I said. The boy looked at me for a long time, as if weighing whether I was insane, reckless, or just naive. Maybe I was all three. But I could see something else in his eyes now, a flicker of hope, buried deep, like an ember under ash. Neither of us knew it then, but Cade's men weren't going to give us the luxury of time. That night, the riders came. And they didn't knock. Morning in Dry Creek didn't feel like morning anywhere else. There was no freshness in the air, no promise of a new day, just the same stale heat that clung to everything like an invisible film. By the time the sun had cleared the low ridgeline, the street was already busy with wagons creaking under sacks of grain, men haggling over cattle prices, and women with baskets of laundry headed for the pump on the south end. From the outside, it could have been any frontier town. But when you looked closer, you saw the difference. People here didn't just move about their business, they moved as if someone was watching. Every glance over a shoulder, every hesitation before speaking, told the same story. Fear had been baked into the place so long it was part of the mortar between the boards. The boy, who still hadn't given me a name, rode beside me, head ducked low, brim of his hat pulled so far forward I could barely see his face. I could feel the tension rolling off him, like he expected a hand to grab him from the crowd at any moment. We stopped outside the general store, partly because I needed supplies, partly because I figured it was as good a place as any to pick up the scent of local talk. The store was a narrow, shadowy place, with shelves crowded high and the faint smell of molasses and gun oil in the air. An older man stood behind the counter, wire-rimmed spectacles sliding down his nose. He gave me a nod but didn't smile. Not unusual, but the way his gaze lingered on the boy told me he knew exactly who I'd brought into town. Coffee, flour, salt, I said, placing my coins on the counter. The man set each item down slow, deliberate, like he was buying time to decide whether or not to speak. Finally, without looking up, he said, "You'd best be moving on quick. Cade's got eyes in here." I kept my voice low. "Maybe I'm looking for Cade." That made him pause. His eyes lifted, sharp and assessing. "Then you're either braver than most or dumber than most. I haven't decided which." The boy stiffened beside me, but I didn't answer. Sometimes silence is the best way to get a man to keep talking. And sure enough, the storekeeper leaned a little closer, lowering his voice. "Word is Cade's expecting company from the east. Big shipment. Weapons, maybe. No one says it outright, but the kind of men gathering in town? They're not here for cattle prices." I left it at that, collected my goods, and stepped outside. The boy's eyes flicked from one side of the street to the other. "He knows me," he muttered. "Probably," I said. "But he didn't call you out, which means he's either scared or he's loyal to Cade. Not sure which is worse." We moved down the street toward the livery, passing a saloon with green-painted shutters thrown open. Music spilled out, a jaunty piano tune, but it couldn't quite mask the sound of raised voices inside. I glanced in and saw 3 men at a corner table, one of them with a badge pinned to his vest. Town law. The other 2 were dressed in trail dust and arrogance. Cade's men, I'd wager. The badge holder laughed at something one of them said, leaning back like they were old friends. So much for justice in Dry Creek. At the livery, I paid a wiry man with a limp to stable our horses. He gave me a once-over, then looked at the boy. "Ain't you?" he started, but I cut him off with a glance sharp enough to draw blood. He shut his mouth, took the reins, and hobbled off. We needed information, and I knew the best place to get it wasn't from people who would speak plain. It was from those who couldn't help letting things slip when the whiskey ran deep. So, toward evening, I left the boy in the small room I'd rented above the stables, told him to stay put, keep the door locked, and open it for no one but me. He didn't argue, which told me he understood the stakes. The saloon was louder by nightfall. Lantern light pooled gold across the scarred tables, catching on the edges of playing cards and the metal glint of revolvers half hidden under jackets. I ordered a drink, took a seat near the back, and kept my ears open. It didn't take long to hear Cade's name. A man at the next table, big shoulders, rough hands, voice like gravel, was telling a story about the last fool who tried to skip out on his debt. The others laughed in that uneasy way that says they're not sure if it's safe to laugh at all. From the way they talked, Cade's operation wasn't just about collecting money owed. He owned people here, body and soul. And if you didn't pay with coin, you paid with service, hauling freight for him, guarding shipments, doing whatever dirty work needed doing. That debt contract the boy mentioned? It wasn't a legal paper. It was a chain, and the only way out was to break it or let it choke you. Halfway through my second drink, a shadow fell across my table. I looked up into the narrow face of a man wearing a black coat despite the heat. His eyes were pale, cold, the kind that don't blink much. "You're new," he said. "Passing through," I replied. His gaze flicked over me, measuring. Cade likes to know who's in his town. Likes to know if they're here for business or trouble. "I'm not in the habit of telling other men my business," I said, keeping my voice level. That earned me the faintest smile. "Then I'll tell you something instead. If you've got any sense, you'll ride out come morning." He turned and walked away without another word. I watched him go, memorizing the way he moved. Not a gunman, exactly, but close enough. The kind of man Cade would send ahead to sniff out danger. By the time I left the saloon, the street was quiet. I climbed the stairs to the boys' room and knocked our agreed signal, 3 short, 2 long. The door opened a crack, then wider. "They were here," he said before I could step inside. "Who?" "2 of Cade's men. Asked the stable hand if he'd seen me. He lied, said no. But they'll be back." I set the coffee and bread I'd brought on the small table, then sat across from him. "You're going to have to tell me everything, sooner or later. What you did, what you know, and why Cade wants you bad enough to send men sniffing around." He hesitated, staring down at his hands. Then, finally, he said, "I took something from him. Something worth more than all the coin he keeps locked up. And I'm not giving it back." That was all he offered, and for the moment, it was enough. Whatever it was, it had teeth, sharp enough to draw Cade's blood if used right. But it also meant we were running out of time. The night in Dry Creek had an edge sharp enough to cut steel. The wind wasn't blowing, but the air felt charged, as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. Maybe it was the secret the boy carried, a secret dangerous enough to stir the dead. I sat on the edge of the creaking bed in the tiny room above the stables, watching the boy pace like a caged animal. His eyes, sharp and dark, darted toward the window every few seconds, as if expecting to see the black-coated man from the saloon waiting in the shadows. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice low. "I'm not here to make threats, but if Cade's men find you before we get out of this, there won't be any talk left." He stopped pacing, swallowed hard, and finally met my gaze. "There's no easy way to say it. I took something from Cade. Something important. Something that could break him if it gets out." "What is it?" He shook his head, fear breaking through his usual stoicism. "Not here. Not now. But it's more than money or guns. It's a list, a ledger. Names, deals, payoffs. If anyone saw it, the whole town could fall." The weight of that hit me like a fist. A ledger like that would explain everything. Why Cade ruled Dry Creek with iron fists, why everyone was so scared, and why the lawmen were on his payroll. Suddenly, the door rattled violently. I grabbed the boy and shoved him down under the bed just as two rough voices shouted from below. "Open up. We know you're in there," one barked. The door rattled again. "Cade's orders. We're taking you in." I slipped to the window and peered out. Two men stood below, rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes scanning the shadows. Their faces were hard, marked by sun and dirt, but their movements were too practiced, too coordinated to be just hired thugs. These were Cade's best. "Stay quiet," I whispered to the boy. "We're going to have to fight our way out." The men started to break down the door, splintering wood as I grabbed the rusted iron poker from the corner. I didn't have a gun, but I had to buy us time. The door crashed open, and the two men spilled into the room. I swung the poker hard, catching the first man in the ribs. He grunted, stumbling back, but the second one was already lunging. We fought in the tight space, fists and wood and grit flying. The boy scrambled out from under the bed, his face pale but determined. "Run!" I yelled, knocking the second man back just as the first recovered. We burst down the stairs and into the dark alley behind the stable. The sound of men shouting and pounding footsteps echoed behind us as we sprinted toward the edge of town. The boy's breathing was ragged. "We can't stay here," he said. "Cade's men will hunt us until they find us." I nodded. "We'll find help. But first, we need to understand what we're dealing with." We ducked into a narrow gap between two buildings and caught our breath. I looked at him, the weight of what we'd just escaped sinking in. "What's your name?" I asked quietly. He hesitated but then said, "Jean." "Jean," I repeated. "All right, Jean. We're going to get through this. But you have to trust me." He nodded slowly, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. The next morning, we left the confines of Dry Creek behind. The landscape stretched out before us, rolling hills scorched by the sun, the endless blue of the sky, and the distant promise of salvation. But salvation was far from certain. We rode hard, pushing our horses to their limits. The ledger Jean had stolen wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of power, control, and secrets worth killing for. Silas Cade wouldn't let it go without a fight. At the edge of the next town, we stopped at a ramshackle tavern, where the air smelled of stale beer and smoke. I slipped inside to gather information while Jean waited outside. Inside, I found a man nursing a whiskey, eyes sharp beneath a battered hat. You look like you've seen trouble, he said. Trouble's following me, I replied. He smiled, revealing a missing tooth. Names document. If you're looking to stick around, you'll want allies. Cade's reach goes far, but so does his list. Doc, we need help. We've got something that can bring Cade down, but we're running out of time. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. All right. But first, we need to find out who's after you. Cade's men don't make mistakes. Over the next few hours, Doc and I pieced together the network Cade had built. Corrupt sheriffs, crooked merchants, and worse. Men who would kill without hesitation to protect their interests. Jean stayed outside, restless but watching. When I returned, I told him what I'd learned. We're not just fighting Cade, I said. We're fighting the whole town. Jin's jaw clenched. Then we'll have to burn it down. That night, we camped beneath the stars, the ledger safe between us. I could hear Jean whispering to himself, running through the names and numbers he'd memorized. The quiet was shattered by a rustling in the bushes. I reached for my pistol, heart pounding. Out stepped Doc, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Got this from one of Cade's men, he said. A warning. They're closing in. We sat in silence, the fire crackling between us. Tomorrow, we'd have to make our move. The ledger was our weapon, and Cade's empire was about to feel its sting. The next day, as the sun crept above the horizon, we rode toward Dry Creek once more. This time, we weren't running, we were coming to fight. The ride back toward Dry Creek was different. The morning sun didn't bring warmth or hope, it cast long, cold shadows across the dusty plains. Jean sat stiffly beside me, eyes fixed on the horizon where the familiar outline of the town grew sharper with every mile. There was a weight in the silence between us. Not just the burden of the stolen ledger hidden beneath my jacket, but the unspoken understanding that this was no longer a simple flight. This was a fight for survival, for justice, for something beyond ourselves. The ledger's burden. We rode hard and fast, the horses' hooves thundering on the cracked earth like the ticking of a relentless clock. The ledger that could unravel everything Silas Cade had built, rested against my chest, a fragile paper fortress containing secrets powerful enough to shatter the foundations of the entire town. I glanced at Jean. His face was pale, worn from sleepless nights, but his eyes held a fierce determination that no exhaustion could dim. We're close, I said quietly. Once we're inside, we have to be careful. Cade's men won't just roll over. Jean nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. What do you think is in that ledger? Names? Bribes? Maybe even murders? Worse, I said. It's everything. Every crooked deal, every betrayal, every secret kept under lock and key. If we expose it, Cade loses his grip. But if he finds us first... He didn't need me to finish. Back in the lion's den. Dry Creek looked the same as always, dust swirling in the street, tumbleweeds tumbling lazily, the usual creak of the general store sign swinging in the light breeze. But beneath the calm surface was a poison that twisted everything. Fear, silence, and control. We dismounted a block from the center and moved carefully toward the saloon, the heart of Cade's operation. The building loomed, dark windows watching like unblinking eyes. Inside, we'll split up, I whispered. You find the sheriff's office. Look for allies, anyone still honest. I'll distract Cade. Jin's eyes widened. You're going to face Cade alone? It's the only way to draw him out. If we wait, he'll come for us. But if I confront him, it might give you the chance you need. He hesitated, then nodded. Be careful. Shadows of the past. I pushed open the saloon door, the smell of stale whiskey and smoke washing over me. The room fell almost silent for a heartbeat, then murmurs returned. Men and women glanced up from their drinks, eyes flickering with suspicion and fear. Silas Cade sat behind the bar, his broad shoulders and sharp eyes cutting through the haze. He looked every bit the ruthless kingpin, calm and deadly. Well, he said, his voice low and oily. If it isn't the prodigal ghost. Thought you'd run off and forgotten us. I didn't answer. Instead, I placed the ledger on the bar. Do you know what you're holding? Cade asked, eyes narrowing. I know it's your downfall. He laughed, a sound like gravel grinding under a boot. You don't scare me. You've got one chance to hand it over and walk out. Otherwise, you'll join the rest who thought they could bring me down. I stood my ground, hands steady. I'm not here to bargain. Behind Cade, his men started to reach for their guns. The tension exploded. Jin's dangerous game. Meanwhile, Jean slipped through Dry Creek's back alleys toward the sheriff's office. The building was battered but stood like a fortress against the corruption surrounding it. Inside, Deputy Harris, a grizzled man with eyes haunted by what he'd seen, greeted him cautiously. Who are you? Harris asked. Someone who wants to end Cade's reign, Jean said. I have proof. A ledger with names, deals, everything. Harris's eyes widened. You know what that means. Cade will kill anyone who gets close. If you want help, you'll need to be smart. Quiet. Jean nodded. I'm ready. Together, they made plans to gather any honest men left in the town. But time was against them. Cade's shadow stretched wide, and whispers of their return had already reached his ears. The first clash. Back in the saloon, guns drew in a flash. I dove behind a table, the first shot splintering wood beside me. Chaos erupted, glass shattered, chairs overturned, men shouting. I fired back, the old revolver roaring in my hands. Each shot was a statement. I was not afraid, and I would not back down. Cade's men swarmed, but the room was too crowded. People scrambled for cover, caught in the crossfire. I spotted Cade slipping toward the back door, but before I could follow, a heavy blow caught me in the ribs. I hit the floor hard, the world spinning. Through the haze, I saw Cade's cold smile. This town belongs to me. Jin's risk. At the sheriff's office, Jin's phone call summoned the last remnants of the town's honest lawmen. They were wary, broken by years under Cade's rule, but something in Jin's resolve rekindled their courage. A plan formed: take control of the town's communications, block Cade's reinforcements, and expose the ledger's secrets at the courthouse. But the risk was high. Cade's spies were everywhere, and betrayal lurked in the shadows. Blood on the streets. The firefight in the saloon spilled onto the streets. Shots rang out, horses whinnied, and townsfolk fled in terror. I staggered out, clutching my side, and ran toward the alley where Jean was supposed to meet me. There, amidst the dust and chaos, we found each other. We can't do this alone, I gasped. No, Jean said. But we can start a war. The spark of rebellion. That night, hidden in an abandoned barn on the edge of town, we gathered the brave, the ones still willing to fight. Faces were grim, eyes wary but burning with defiance. Doc joined us, bringing news of allies beyond Dry Creek. We've got a chance, he said. But Cade won't go down easy. Jean unwrapped the ledger, spreading the pages before us. Names. Deals. Corruption so deep it sickened the soul. This is why we fight, Jean said. For truth. For justice. The room was silent, the weight of their choices pressing heavy. A town on the edge. As dawn broke over Dry Creek, the town was no longer just a place, it was a battlefield. Whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire. Cade's empire was cracking, and the ledger was the key. The dawn broke cold over Dry Creek, but the fire inside the barn was burning bright. Faces illuminated by flickering lanterns looked up at us with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. The ledger lay open between us, a silent testament to the truth we intended to unleash. Rallying the broken. The crowd was a mix of townsfolk and drifters, scarred by years under Silas Cade's rule. Farmers, shopkeepers, even a few former deputies who had long since turned their backs on justice, all bound together by a fragile hope. Silas Cade's empire rests on lies and fear, I said, voice echoing in the quiet. This ledger contains proof. Names of his men, his deals, his betrayals. Jean held up a finger, pointing to the pages. Look here, Contracts with outlaws, secret payments to the sheriff, deals that sell our land, our water, our lives. Whispers grew louder, a swell of anger rising like a storm. One woman stepped forward, voice trembling. He took my farm. Took my children's future. I want to fight. A man nodded beside her. Me too. I'm done living in fear. The barn, once a place of refuge, became a forge where a new resistance was born. Cade's retaliation. Far from the barn, Cade's office was a fortress of shadows. He paced in front of a large map pinned with markers, Dry Creek's arteries of power. Find them, he snarled to his men. Burn their hope to ashes. His second-in-command, a lean man named Harker, smirked. They don't even know what they're up against. Cade's eyes glittered dangerously. That's why we'll make them understand. No one betrays Silas Cade and walks away. Orders went out that night. Men on horseback, carrying torches, ready to strike the barn and snuff out the rebellion before it could grow. Preparing for the siege. Back in the barn, we worked tirelessly through the night. Jean and I divided tasks. Secure the exits, Jean said, handing out rifles and knives. Set traps. We'll need to hold them off. Doc handed out homemade explosives and medical supplies. Just remember, he said grimly, if this goes south, I'll be patching wounds. The air was thick with tension and resolve. Everyone knew the danger ahead, yet no one flinched. The first assault. Before the sun rose, the quiet was shattered by the thunder of horses and the glow of torches. Cade's men charged toward the barn like a wave of destruction. We were ready. Gunfire erupted in the cold morning air, the night silence broken by the roar of battle. Bullets tore through wood and flesh. Shouts of pain mingled with curses and orders. I took cover behind a stack of crates, firing until my arms burned. Jean moved like a shadow, striking with deadly precision. The townsfolk fought fiercely, defending their future with every breath. A costly victory. Hours passed like minutes. Slowly, the attackers retreated, bloodied and broken. We'd won the battle, but not without cost. Several brave souls lay wounded or worse. Among them, a young man named Eli, barely 18, who had thrown himself into the fight with reckless courage. I knelt beside Eli, his breathing shallow. Hold on, I whispered, pressing a cloth to a deep wound. His eyes fluttered open, a faint smile forming. For the town, he whispered. For justice. Tears blurred my vision. Cade's cruel counterstrike. That night, the town's usual calm was replaced by whispers of dark deeds. Cade had captured one of our scouts, a woman named Mara, and paraded her through the streets like a warning. She's a traitor, the town crier shouted, but the crowd's faces told a different story. Fear, sorrow, and growing anger. Mara's silent plea from behind the bars haunted us all. Jin's plan. The ledger was more than a weapon. It was a lifeline. Jean gathered us again, this time with a new plan. We expose Cade at the courthouse, he said. Make him face the law in front of everyone. But how? I asked. The sheriff's on Cade's payroll. Not all, Jean replied. Deputy Harris and a few others want justice. We just need to give them the proof, and the courage. The plan was dangerous. Cade controlled the town's guards, the courthouse was heavily fortified, and the people were still scared. But it was our best chance. A flicker of hope. Days passed, filled with preparation and uneasy quiet. The ledger pages were copied and hidden among the townsfolk. Everywhere, whispers spread, like kindling for a blaze. Dry Creek was waking up. And in the shadows, Cade's grip began to slip. The storm approaches. On the eve of the courthouse confrontation, a calm settled over the town. But beneath it, a storm was gathering. Our fight for justice was no longer just about a ledger, or even about Cade. It was about the soul of Dry Creek, and whether the light of truth could ever break through the darkness. The night before the reckoning, Dry Creek felt suspended between two worlds, one clawing desperately at the past, the other trembling with the fragile hope of change. The cool autumn air carried the scent of smoke and earth, but beneath it was a sharper tension, like a taut wire ready to snap. The barn where the resistance had gathered was now silent, but inside each heart burned a fire hotter than ever before. Preparing for the trial. In the dim light of the makeshift headquarters, Jean spread out the ledger, its pages worn but still heavy with truth. Every name inked on those fragile sheets was a thread connecting Silas Cade to the rot beneath Dry Creek's surface. "Tomorrow changes everything," Jean said quietly, folding the ledger carefully. "We bring this to the courthouse, and we make Cade answer for every lie, every crime." I looked around at the faces gathered, weathered, worn, but resolute. Farmers who once bent beneath the weight of oppression now stood tall. Women who hid their fear behind clenched jaws, and men who had traded their guns for hope. They all counted on this moment. Allies in the shadows. Not everyone in Dry Creek was silenced by Cade's iron fist. A few brave souls still held on to their honor in the sheriff's office. Deputy Harris, a man with weary eyes and a steady hand, had quietly reached out to us over the past weeks. "Tomorrow, I'll stand with you," he promised when we met beneath the cover of darkness. Cade's grip is strong, but his time is running out. His presence was a balm to our nerves, but it was also a reminder of how high the stakes were. If Harris faltered, we all fell. The town's awakening. As dawn painted the sky with streaks of gold, the streets of Dry Creek stirred. Whispers spread like wildfire through the saloons, the general store, and the dusty sidewalks. The ledger's truth was out. No one could deny it anymore. Small groups of townsfolk gathered, their faces a mix of fear and determination. Some hid weapons beneath coats, others clutched letters of proof or photographs of ruined homes. The tide was turning. But fear still lingered in the eyes of many. Fear of the retribution that Cade was sure to bring. The courthouse steps. The courthouse loomed like a fortress at the town's center, its heavy wooden doors and barred windows a symbol of authority and corruption. We approached with caution, Jean carrying the ledger wrapped in cloth, the weight of justice heavier than any gun. A crowd had gathered, some drawn by curiosity, others by loyalty to Cade, and a growing number simply hungry for truth. "Today," I called out to the mass of faces, "we stand not as rebels, but as citizens. As those who demand justice. Cade has ruled through fear and lies, but now we bring his crimes into the light." The murmurs grew louder, the crowd shifting. Cade's arrival. Just then, a cloud of dust signaled the arrival of Silas Cade and his men. He stepped down from his horse, a cruel smile tugging at his lips. "So, the little rats think they can bite the lion," he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You come with your little papers and your false accusations. I'm the law in this town." He looked around, daring someone to challenge him. The trial begins. Deputy Harris stepped forward, standing beside us. "The law is for the people, not for tyrants," he said, voice steady. "We will hear the evidence." The doors of the courthouse creaked open, and we were led inside, a room thick with history, dust, and secrets. At the center, a rough-hewn wooden bench where Judge McAllister, a man whose allegiance was uncertain, presided. Jean laid the ledger on the table. "This is proof of Silas Cade's corruption, bribery, intimidation, murder." He began reading aloud, name after name, deal after deal. The room grew heavy with shock and disbelief. Cade's counterattack. Cade's face twisted in rage. "Lies. Fabrications. You bring no proof, only words." But as Jean called witnesses, farmers who had lost their land, shopkeepers forced to pay protection money, even some of Cade's former men, the cracks in Cade's armor began to show. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside. Cade's men tried to break the courthouse doors down. The siege inside. Trapped between the storm outside and the truth inside, the courtroom became a battleground. Gunshots rang out. The crowd inside scrambled for cover, shields of bodies and benches. I grabbed a fallen chair, ready to defend our stand. Jean shouted, "Hold the line. The law is on our side." Deputy Harris returned fire, his eyes blazing with a newfound courage. "A sacrifice." In the chaos, Mara, once paraded as a traitor, slipped through the melee, clutching a hidden revolver. She fired at Cade's second-in-command, Harker, taking him down before being struck herself. She fell to the floor, bleeding but alive. I rushed to her side, heart pounding. "Stay with me," I pleaded. Her hand squeezed mine. "For the town. For justice. The turning point." The townsfolk, inspired by Mara's bravery and the truth unveiled, surged forward. They fought not just for survival, but for the promise of a new dry creek. The sheriff's men wavered, some dropping their weapons, others fleeing. Cade realized the tide had turned. Final confrontation. Cornered, Cade drew his pistol, eyes wild with desperation. "You think you've won," he snarled. "This town belongs to me." Jean stepped forward, steady and calm. "No, Silas. It belongs to its people." A single shot rang out, Cade's pistol flying from his hand as Deputy Harris disarmed him. Justice served. With Cade restrained and his crimes exposed, the courthouse became a beacon of hope. The judge, once hesitant, declared Cade guilty of multiple counts of corruption and violence. His sentence was exile and the forfeiture of all his ill-gotten gains. The townsfolk cheered, tears mixing with smiles. A new dawn for Dry Creek. The sun rose higher, casting golden light on a town reborn. We stood together, battered but unbroken, knowing this was just the beginning. Dry Creek's wounds were deep, but so was its resilience. And as we walked out of the courthouse, the ledger safely hidden away, I realized something profound. Justice was not a moment. It was a fight. The calm after the storm. The morning sun rose over Dry Creek, casting a pale light over the battered streets. The courthouse steps, where the final confrontation with Silas Cade had erupted, now lay quiet and deserted. Townsfolk moved cautiously, some still limping from bruises and scraps, others quietly whispering about what had just happened. The victory over Cade felt like a weight lifted, yet the unease lingered. I stood with Jean, Mara, and Deputy Harris, watching as life in the town tried to resume, but the shadows of the past hung thick in the air. "This is just the beginning," Jean said, his gaze sweeping the streets. "Cade's gone, but the damage he's done? That runs deep." His words struck true. The town was scarred, and the healing wouldn't be quick. The power vacuum. With Cade's empire in ruins, a dangerous silence took hold. His men had scattered, some fled into the wilds, others lurked in the shadows, uncertain what to do next. The town council, long controlled or corrupted by Cade, was fractured. Old rivals saw their chance to claim power, stirring tensions beneath the surface. I knew that unless a new leadership emerged, Dry Creek could spiral back into lawlessness or worse. An unexpected visitor. One evening, as the sky turned amber, Reverend Whitaker came to meet with me and Deputy Harris. Known for his quiet sermons and strong community ties, Whitaker surprised us by speaking as a man of action rather than faith. "Dry Creek needs new leadership," he said, eyes steady. "A council representing all, farmers, workers, business owners, even those with darker pasts. Only then can the town rebuild truly free." His proposal sounded risky, but it felt like a chance, a fragile hope to bind the community together. Divided loyalties. The suggestion ignited fierce debate. Some welcomed a fresh start, eager to shake off Cade's shadow. Others feared losing influence or control. Jean was cautious but open-minded. Mara quietly supported the idea, hoping for a better future. Deputy Harris saw the complexities but was willing to try. Town meetings were heated affairs, often spilling into the streets long after sunset, as old wounds reopened and new alliances took shape. The shadow returns. Just when the town began to breathe a little easier, word spread like wildfire. A band of outlaws, led by a ruthless figure known as the Viper, had been spotted near the mountains, moving toward Dry Creek. Rumors said they were remnants of Cade's mercenaries, loyal to chaos and control. Fear gripped the town once again. Preparing for war. We couldn't wait for trouble to find us. Jean and Mara rallied volunteers, strengthening barricades and teaching basic firearm skills to farmers and townsfolk. Deputy Harris organized patrols and watch posts. Nights were restless, filled with whispered strategies and the sharpening of knives. Every soul in Dry Creek braced for what might come. The Viper's approach. Under the cover of darkness, the Viper and his gang slithered toward the town. Their arrival was silent but deadly, a threat that turned hope back into dread. The tension in Dry Creek thickened like the dust in the air. The town held its breath, caught between the fragile hope that had blossomed after Silas Cade's fall and the creeping dread of the threat looming on the horizon. The Viper and his gang were more than just remnants of Cade's empire. They were something darker, bloodthirsty predators who thrived on fear and chaos. 4 days, the people of Dry Creek prepared. Jean, Mara, Deputy Harris, and I coordinated every detail we could muster. We trained the farmers and shopkeepers, turned every available hand into a defender. We fortified buildings, stacked supplies, and planned ambush points along the narrow canyons surrounding the town. We knew that once the Viper's gang struck, there would be no turning back. Night after night, I lay awake in the boarding house, listening to the distant howls of coyotes, the faint whispers of the wind through the cracked windows. Lee May's words echoed in my mind. This isn't over. She had seen what men like Cade and the Viper could do, how they twisted people, turned them into shadows of themselves. It was my burden now to protect not only her but the whole town from slipping into darkness again. The day the Viper's gang appeared was unremarkable at first. A hot sun bore down on the dry earth, and most townsfolk were busy with daily chores, trying to reclaim normalcy. But as shadows stretched longer and the sun dipped toward the horizon, unease settled in. Eyes scanned the distant ridges where the dust cloud rose, an ominous plume that swallowed the fading light. I found Jean and Mara near the main street, eyes fixed on the horizon. "They're coming," Jean said quietly. His voice held the same steady calm he'd shown since the beginning, but even he couldn't hide the grim set of his jaw. Mara tightened her grip on the rifle slung across her back. "We need to hold them off long enough for the people to escape if it comes to that." I nodded, the weight of responsibility settling heavier on my shoulders than ever before. This wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about survival, of the town, the people, and the fragile freedom we'd clawed back from tyranny. The Viper's gang moved fast, their approach marked by a brutal efficiency that spoke of cold planning and ruthless intent. We had time to set up only a handful of defenses before they reached the outskirts, but every barricade and sniper's post counted. The quiet streets soon echoed with the sharp crack of rifles and the heavy thuds of footsteps pounding earth. The battle erupted under a blood-red sky. Gunfire cracked like thunder, smoke curling into the air as buildings shook from the impact of stray bullets. Townsfolk who had never fired a gun before took cover behind crates and barrels, their faces pale but resolute. Jean and Mara moved with precision, picking targets and rallying fighters. I stayed near the boarding house, coordinating messengers and watching Lee May help the wounded. Her strength surprised me. Despite everything, she refused to be broken. Each life saved was a small victory against the darkness. But the gang was relentless. They came with a savagery that betrayed their desperation. The Viper himself was a shadow in the chaos, quick, brutal, and merciless. His presence was like a poison, cutting through morale with whispered threats and bloodied deeds. Hours dragged on, the sun long gone, replaced by the cold, unforgiving night. We fought with everything we had, but the tide began to turn against us. The Viper's men breached the east barricade, pouring into the town's heart. Panic threatened to unravel the defenders, but Mara's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold your ground. For Dry Creek. For freedom." Her rallying cry reignited the fire in us. We pushed back, inch by inch, turning the streets into a deadly maze. Every shot fired was a promise that we wouldn't give in. Then came the moment I dreaded, the direct confrontation. The Viper stepped into the light, face scarred and cruel, eyes burning with hate. Our guns raised, fingers twitching on triggers, but it was me he sought. He sneered. "You think you can stand against me? I am the nightmare that never dies." I met his gaze steadily. "You're the nightmare this town is waking from." We circled, words unspoken but heavy in the air. Then chaos exploded again as shots rang out, and the fight became personal. I could feel every heartbeat, every breath a battle within me. The memories of Cade's terror, the faces of those who suffered under his rule, the fear in Li Mei's eyes when she first came to me, they all surged like fire. The Viper lunged, fast and wild. Our guns discharged in near unison, but I was quicker. My bullet found its mark in his shoulder, and he staggered, rage boiling over into fury. The fight was brutal, a deadly dance on the cracked wood of the saloon steps. Blows were exchanged, desperate and raw. He was strong, but I was driven by something stronger. Justice for those who couldn't fight, hope for those who had none left. Finally, I disarmed him, sending his gun skittering across the dusty street. With one last fierce look, he dropped to his knees, the fight draining from his eyes. The remaining gang members, seeing their leader defeated, faltered and began to scatter. Jean and Mara led the charge to cut off their retreat, turning the battle into a hunt. When the dust finally settled, Dry Creek lay battered but unbroken. The cost was high, too many lives lost, too many scars that would never fully heal, but the darkness that had plagued the town was finally pushed back. In the quiet aftermath, I walked through the streets, feeling the weight of every moment. Li Mei found me near the edge of town, her eyes reflecting a cautious hope. "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" she asked softly. I nodded, feeling the truth of her words deep in my bones. "It is. But this time, we'll face it together." Because in Dry Creek, justice was more than guns and battles. It was the courage to stand when others faltered, the strength to rebuild from the ruins, and the promise that no one would face the night alone. The dawn broke over Dry Creek with a fragile golden light that felt almost like a promise. The air was crisp, tinged with the smell of smoke and dust, remnants of the battle that had raged through the night. For the first time in months, the town seemed to hold its breath in peace, the silence a stark contrast to the roar of gunfire and shouted commands that had filled its streets. I stood on the wooden porch of the boarding house, looking out at the scarred town below. Every cracked window, every splintered door, every broken plank whispered the story of struggle, but also survival. The sun rose slowly, illuminating the faces of the people beginning to stir. They were tired, their eyes shadowed by loss and exhaustion, but within them burned a light that nothing could extinguish. Li Mei came out beside me, her hands folded tightly in front of her. Her usual hard edges softened by the quiet morning, but I could see the same strength that had carried her through the darkest days. "It's over," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Not over," I replied, eyes fixed on the horizon. "This was just the beginning of what we have to rebuild." The silence between us held more meaning than any words. Dry Creek had been more than a town to me. It was a symbol, a crucible where broken souls were forged into something stronger, something unbreakable. The aftermath was chaos in its own way. The townsfolk banded together to tend the wounded, bury the dead, and repair the damage. Jean and Mara worked tirelessly, organizing patrols and setting up defenses, wary of any last-ditch attempts by surviving outlaws or opportunists. The sheriff's office, once a symbol of lawlessness and fear, became the heart of a new hope, a place where justice would no longer be dictated by the barrel of a gun, but by the people's will. The Viper was gone. The man who had haunted our nights and threatened to drown us in blood and fire was finally silent. When he fell, so too did the shadow he cast over Dry Creek. But even in victory, I knew the scars he left behind would not vanish with his death. In the days that followed, stories spread. Stories of bravery and sacrifice. Stories of unlikely friendships and quiet heroism. Stories of the girl who had found her voice again after years of silence, of the farmer who had taken up arms to protect his home, of the stranger who refused to run and instead stood to fight. And in the center of it all stood Li Mei, no longer just a survivor, but a symbol of resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky bled colors of fire and rose, she approached me quietly. "What now?" she asked, eyes searching mine. "What now?" I echoed. "We live. We rebuild. We remember." She smiled, a small, tired curve of her lips. "And what about you?" I looked away, toward the fading light. I stay. Dry Creek is my home now. I owe it that much. She nodded, her gaze steady. Then let's make sure it's a home worth fighting for. Weeks turned into months, and life began to return to Dry Creek. The saloon reopened, its doors creaking but welcoming. Children's laughter echoed down the dusty streets where once there had only been fear. Markets bustled with new energy, farmers tilled the earth with renewed hope, and the night skies were no longer filled with dread but with the quiet hum of normalcy. But beneath the surface, change had taken root. The people had learned that freedom was not just the absence of tyranny, but the presence of courage and community. They understood now that their strength came not from guns alone, but from unity, from the willingness to stand for each other when darkness threatened. I found myself drawn into this new world, not as a wandering drifter, but as part of something greater. The boardwalks, once paths of mere passage, became gathering places for stories, plans, and laughter. I took on the role of protector and mentor, teaching those who wanted to learn how to defend what they loved, but also how to build rather than destroy. Mara remained a fierce guardian, her presence a reminder that vigilance was never over. Jean, once a quiet shadow, stepped forward as a leader in his own right, guiding the town's efforts with calm authority. Together, we formed a new kind of family, one born of fire and tempered by shared pain. But peace, like the desert wind, can shift without warning. One night, as I sat by the fire outside the boarding house, Lee May joined me. The stars stretched endlessly above, indifferent witnesses to our fragile hope. "I've been thinking," she said softly, eyes reflecting the flames. "There's still so much out there, beyond Dry Creek, that needs fighting for. Maybe this town was just the first step." I met her gaze, feeling the weight of the truth in her words. "You want to leave?" She smiled, a quiet determination in her eyes. "No. Not now. But someday. We can't forget the world beyond these hills." I nodded, understanding that freedom wasn't a place, but a journey. A path that would take us beyond the borders of Dry Creek, carrying the lessons we'd learned and the fires we'd sparked. That night, we made a silent pact. No matter where the road led, we would face it together, forged by the battles behind us and the hope ahead. Dry Creek wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was ours. A place where justice was fought for, not given, where scars told stories of survival, not defeat, where the dawn wasn't just the end of a night, but the beginning of a promise. I looked once more at the town I'd come to love, the place that had given me more than I ever expected. Friendship, purpose, and a reason to stand tall. And as the first light touched the horizon, I knew that this story wasn't the end. It was the foundation of something new. A testament that even in the darkest of places, hope can grow, fierce, unyielding, and eternal. Because in the end, that was what we were fighting for. Not just survival. Not just victory. But the chance to live free. And in Dry Creek, that chance had finally been won. If you were in his shoes, would you have fought the same fight? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video. Explore the other stories on the screen. There's more to discover, more battles to witness.